Hello, class. This is Professor Quigley, and I have great news for you. You can no longer say that you have programming experience. You are now building your resume and well on your way to making a bunch of money working in the field as a computer programmer. But you have to stick with it. In week 2, we're going to learn variables. And variables are super exciting because they make your application really smart. Alright class, well I want to make this video start off with where many of you were confused last week. Many of you have reached out to me and said, what the heck does get next input mean? I know some of you saw that and were completely lost. Also, what the heck is a variable? Or better yet, what does it mean when we put something to output? So let me actually explain what that means using the application that we flowcharted out last week. So in our area calculator example, we decided that we're going to get the length, get the width, then we're going to say length times width. We're going to store whatever that value is into area, and then we're going to output area to the screen. And so if you remember, we also discussed inputs, processes, and outputs where we said we need to know what the length is, we need to know what the width is, then here's the process and here's the area. So as we learn what variables are this week, just know that length is going to be a variable, width is going to be a variable, and then area is going to be a variable. All right, so let's take a look at our application in pseudocode. So in pseudocode, this is what it's going to look like if you were to write this in Zybooks. You would declare the variables. I need a variable called length, width, and area. And then I'm going to say the length equals get next input. Now, you might be wondering what get next input means, and I'm going to show you that over here when I actually run an actual real world application. But for now, know that when you type get next input, what it means is that you're telling Zybooks you want Zybooks to simulate a user using this application. So remember, if you're building an application, you don't want it to output the same thing over and over and over. You want your application to be smart enough so that way whenever Sam uses the application, remember Samsung from our last week video? Whenever Sam's using this application, you want him to type in the length of the room, and you want him to type in the width of his room. You don't want it to always output the same answer. So you have to use variables, and you have to understand what variables are if you're ever going to make a ton of money and build an application that's real smart. Whatever the value that user typed in using that get next input command, you're going to take those two variables, multiply them together, and then you're going to store that into area. Now, you don't want to write put 12 to output, because that means every time your application runs, it's always going to output in quotes the same value over and over. So what you have to actually do when using a variable is to actually put the variable to output. That is going to basically output whatever the value is being held. So let me explain. Let's go ahead and run this application. And if I were just to kind of show you this code briefly, I do the same thing that we do here. These sequence of events that we follow is exactly what I do over here in the code. I get the length, I get the width, I calculate the area, and then I output the area. So let's go ahead and run this application so you can fully understand what it means to get next input, what it means to assign whatever they use from get next input into a variable, and do some math and output it. So the first thing my program does is says, what is the length of the room? So I'm going to type in 10. Then it's going to say, what is the width of the room? And I'm going to type in 2. And I click enter, and it says the area of the room was 20. That's an awesome application because now when I run it again, I can do something completely different. I can say the room is 200 length, and then I can say the width is going to be 300, and then it's going to let me know the area of that room is 60,000 square feet. So that is one big room. So the only way you're going to get your application smart enough to where it actually provides value to users is if you understand variables. So let me drop a breakpoint in here. And remember, I'm using Visual Studio. This is not source code. So if you pay attention, you follow along with me throughout the next 10 weeks, I promise you can start learning Visual Studio. You can follow along, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have and prepare you for your first real programming job. So what I'm going to do is I'm dropping a breakpoint on line 16. And if you remember, we discussed sequence last week. Sequence basically means the computer is going to execute every computer statement one line at a time. So each line, line 10, is a set of instructions. So this is a computer statement, this is a computer statement, this is a computer statement, and so forth. So my breakpoint is basically saying run the application, but whenever it gets to line 16, stop, so that way I as a developer can analyze and debug and try to troubleshoot and find out what exactly my application is doing. So I'm going to click play. Now my application real quickly executed lines 1 through 15, and now I'm sitting here on line 15. If I mouse over, and if you're watching this on a phone, you might want to watch this on your computer and go full screen with this video, because this tooltip right here is real tiny. But if I mouse over that variable length, I can see that it has a value of 0. And the reason why it has a value of 0 is because I haven't typed in anything yet. So in C#, where it says convert.to N32 and then in parentheses console.readline, that is the equivalent, the non-pseudocode. This is why pseudocode is so important and why Zybooks is doing us a favor, because it's easier for us to understand that we want the value of length to equal get next input. Get next input means whatever the user types in, I wanted to store it here. So I'm doing this in C#, but right now the variable is 0. So when I click F11, I'm going to execute that line of code, and I am going to type in 10. And when I click enter, now you'll notice that the computer went to line 19. So now if I mouse over line 16, I can see that the value for length is 10. That's the power of variables, because I was able to reserve a spot in memory, store a value in there, and then later be able to recall it whenever I need to. So on line 19, I'm going to execute that one. Now if I mouse over width, even though length has a value of 10, width still has a value of 0 because that line of code hasn't executed yet. So I'm going to hit F11. What is the width of the room? I'm going to type in, we'll do 12, and I click enter. Now when I mouse over width, I can see that that variable holds the value 12. Now I'm sitting on line 23. So when I mouse over the area variable, I can see the value is 0, and that's because line 23 hasn't executed yet. But if I mouse over length, that was already set previously. So length has a value of 10, width has a value of 12. So what I expect to happen is when line 23 execute, it's going to take the value of the length, the value of width, times those together, and then it's going to store it over here in a variable called area. So when I hit F11, the computer advances, and now when I mouse over area, it says area now has a value of 120. And then real important over here, I am outputting a string here. So this is where I say in quotes, I want it to output every time the area of the room is space, and then I'm going to reference the variable. So that way, every time that application runs, it's going to reference the variables in which we stored values. I really hope that makes sense. If for some reason that doesn't make sense, shoot me over a message and I'll be glad to hop on the phone. Maybe I'll make a different video. But I promise you, learning variables is very important this week. Don't skip this week. Make sure you hop into the discussion threads. Learn what data types are. Learn what the naming conventions are and the rules whenever you name a variable. I promise you that if you learn these things, this is going to be the secret to making a ton of money in the computer programming field. I promise you these are the very important basics, and we also use these important basics every day in the field. So again, I'm happy to help. Watch the helpful videos as you go through this week's challenge activities, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I'm here to help.